Welcome to the History and Heritage podcast with me, Liam Blake. Join me as we uncover hidden stories and insights that shaped our world. From mysteries to legacies, join us on this journey through time.
Ireland in the 12th century was a land in the midst of upheaval. Old dynasties were shifting, the church was being reformed, and foreign ambitions were beginning to cast long shadows across the island. Yet, out of that turbulent time came a man whose life embodied both the suffering and the sanctity of the age. A prince who became a monk who became an archbishop, and a saint, all the same man, who became a peacemaker in a land at war. His name was Lorcán Ua Tuathail, known to most of us today as Saint Laurence O'Toole. Lorcán was born around the year 1128 in the hills of Leinster. His father, Ua Tuathail, was a Gaelic king, a chieftain in a landscape still governed by kinship and loyalty. But that loyalty was fragile, and power in Ireland at the time was constantly contested. The most powerful figure in the region was a man we have met in the Murphy episode, Diarmid Mac Murcha, King of Leinster, a man whose name would later be tied to one of the most fateful events in Irish history, the coming of the Normans. It was to this same Diarmid that Lorcán, barely 10 years old, was given as a hostage. This was how peace was kept between rival kings, by handing over one's own flesh and blood. What followed was a time of great cruelty. Lorcán was sent to a remote place, chained, half-starved, and left exposed to the cold. The boy who had been born into comfort and privilege was stripped of everything. And yet, that very suffering became a fire that purified him. He never forgot those years. In the silence of his captivity, he learned what it meant to rely only on God. When at last his father threatened revenge, Diarmid relented and released him into the care of the Bishop of Glendalough, a place that would shape the rest of Lorcán's life. When his father came to reclaim him, the king proposed to dedicate one of his sons to the church and suggested they draw lots to see which. Lorcán, still barely more than a boy, laughed and said there was no need. He had already made his choice. He would serve God. At Glendalough, the deep valley of saints and scholars, the boy who had suffered became a monk. In that monastic world, where prayer and work marked every hour, Lorcán found peace, and the years of humiliation and hardship that had once seemed unbearable became the foundation of his compassion. By the time he was 25, he had been elected abbot of Glendalough, one of the most revered monastic settlements in Ireland, founded centuries earlier by St. Kevin. To lead such a community at that age was no small thing, but Lorcán was no ordinary leader. He brought with him a rare mix of gentleness and firmness, of prayerful devotion and practical wisdom. His early years as abbot were marked by crisis. A terrible famine swept through the region, and violence was everywhere. Even noblemen turned to robbery. Lorcán sold the treasures of the monastery to feed the hungry. To some, that might have seemed reckless, but to him, the only true treasure was charity. When thieves and oppressors continued to threaten his people, he turned to spiritual means, prayer, fasting, and solemn public penance. The monks recorded that when he fasted and prayed for deliverance, those who had tormented the poor were struck by fear and shame, and the attacks stopped. It wasn't vengeance, it was the faith of a man who believed that justice and mercy were not opposites, but two sides of the same coin. In 1162, Lorcán's life changed again. The Archbishop of Dublin had died, and the clergy, the people, and the High King himself agreed there was no better man to take up the mantle than the Abbot of Glendalough. And so, Lorcán Ua Tuathail, at 34, became Archbishop of Dublin. At that time, Dublin was a Norse-Irish city, wealthy in trade but spiritually impoverished. The clergy needed reform, the poor were neglected, and the city's old Norse roots still ran deep. Lorcán took up residence at Christ Church Cathedral and immediately began to rebuild, not just the stones of the church, but its soul. He invited the canons regular of St. Augustine to form a community there, and he lived among them as one of their own. His personal life was marked by deep asceticism. He wore a hair shirt beneath his robes, fasted regularly, and refused to eat meat. On Fridays, he would take nothing but bread and water. Yet he never imposed austerity on others. When guests came to dine, he provided food and drink generously, while quietly pouring himself water, often coloured with drops of wine, so that no one would notice his abstinence. It was an act of humility and courtesy, a sign that his holiness was not meant to draw attention to itself. But if his inner life was one of prayer, his public life was one of relentless labour. The Norman invasion had begun, and Ireland was being torn apart. That same Dermot MacMurrough, who had once held him hostage, had now invited Norman knights from Wales and England to help him reclaim his kingdom, and with them came a tide of conquest that would change Ireland forever. When the Normans besieged Dublin, panic spread through the city. The people turned to their archbishop, begging him to negotiate peace. Lorcán went out to the invaders' camp and tried to arrange a truce, but as he spoke, treachery was already unfolding. 2 Norman knights breached the walls, and chaos erupted. Houses started to burn as people were being slaughtered in the streets. Lorcán rushed back and, through sheer force of presence, stopped the killing. It's hard to imagine the courage that took. A single unarmed man stepping into the midst of the soldiers, his only weapon the authority of a life lived in truth. That moment defined him. From then on, even those who had invaded came to respect him. Gaelic chiefs, Norse merchants, and Norman barons alike saw in him a man who could be trusted. He became the mediator between 2 worlds, native Ireland and the new foreign power. In 1175, it was Lorcán who helped negotiate the Treaty of Windsor between King Henry II of England and the Irish High King Ruaidhrí Ó Cruthaoir. It was a peace built on uneasy terms, but it showed the same spirit that guided him all his life, a refusal to surrender hope, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And through it all, he remained a priest. He continued to care for the poor, feed dozens every day from his own table, found hospitals and orphanages, and ensure that the Church of Dublin served the people, not itself. Stories of miracles began to spread, not grand spectacles, but small, quiet signs of grace. Yet one extraordinary event stood out. While visiting Canterbury, at the tomb of St. Thomas Becket, Lorcán was struck on the head by a deranged man who wanted to create another martyr. The blow was so violent that blood poured from his skull. Those around him were sure he would die. However, Lorcán asked for water, blessed it, and washed his wound, and the bleeding stopped immediately. He went on to celebrate Mass that same day. When his relics were examined centuries later, the mark was still visible on the skull, and, in a gesture of forgiveness that spoke louder than any miracle, he later secured pardon for his attacker. Even as Archbishop, Lorcán remained a man of Glendalough at heart. Every Lent he would retreat there for 40 days, climbing to St. Kevin's Bed, a lonely cave high above the lake, to pray in solitude. There, overlooking the valley that had shaped his soul, he found renewal. In 1180, he set out on what would become his final journey. He travelled to Normandy to meet King Henry II, who had broken the terms of the Irish treaty. But before he could return home, he fell ill at the Abbey of St. Victor in Ua. Those who were with him urged him to make a will. He smiled and said, "God knows I have not a penny under this sun to leave anyone." His last words were for his people in Dublin. "Alas, you poor foolish people, what will you do now? Who will take care of you in your trouble?" He died there, far from home, on the 14th of November 1180. But his death was followed quickly by signs of his holiness. Miracles were reported at his tomb, and in 1225 Pope Honorius III declared him a saint, the first Irishman canonised after the Norman invasion. For centuries his heart was kept in Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin a symbol of a shepherd who had given everything for his flock. In 2012, that relic was stolen. The theft caused deep sorrow, not because of superstition, but because it felt like a wound to the memory and the people itself. 6 years later, the heart was mysteriously returned. Reports said that the thieves had suffered illness and misfortune and believed the relic was cursed. Perhaps it was conscience, or perhaps something greater, that moved them. Either way, the heart of St. Laurence O'Toole, Lorcán Ua Tuathail, came home again, whole, enduring, and untamed by time. St. Laurence O'Toole's story doesn't just belong to the 12th century. It belongs to every age that struggles to hold faith and integrity together in a broken world. His courage, his tenderness, and his refusal to give up on peace, even when peace seemed impossible, make him one of the greatest witnesses of Irish history. His life reminds us that holiness is not an escape from history, but the redemption of it. I'm Liam Blake, and this is the History and Heritage Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more stories of Ireland's past and present, from priests to puppies, wherever you get your podcasts, and follow me on Instagram at Liam Blake Podcaster. Until next time, as St. Laurence O'Toole himself might have said, may God bless you, and may the stories of our past keep the flame of faith alive in the present.